The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under the weight of a vast, indifferent sky. For Arthur Blackwood, this silence was both a punishment and a sanctuary. His ranch was a lonely island in a sea of Wyoming sagebrush and unforgiving wind, pressed against the stoic foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The place was a monument to a life that had ended before his own had. Every fence post he'd driven, every stone in the hearth he had set with his wife, Eleanor, every patch of earth in the small garden held the ghost of her laughter. And the silence, the god-awful, unending silence, was the space their daughter, little Clara, was supposed to have filled. Grief was not a feeling for Arthur. It was a physical state. It was the permanent chill in his bones that the summer sun could not touch, the stoop in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the labor of the ranch. He had buried them both 7 years ago, taken by a fever that swept through their small world with the speed and mercy of a wildfire. Since then, his life had contracted to the size of his property lines. He tended his small herd of cattle, mended what was broken, and spoke only to his horse and occasionally to the traders in the distant town of Redemption, a place whose name he found to be a bitter irony. His routine was a bulwark against memory, a series of mindless tasks to occupy the hands, while the heart remained a hollow, aching void. He was a man living in the past tense, a walking ghost on his own land. The dawn that changed everything broke like any other, spilling pale, watery light over the eastern plains. Arthur rose from his cot, the familiar ache in his back, a dull companion. He pulled on his worn boots, his movements slow and deliberate, a liturgy of survival. He stepped out of the cabin, intending to draw water from the well, and stopped. The world tilted on its axis. The familiar, empty expanse of his porch was no longer empty. Tied to the 4 support posts were 4 young women, native women. Their wrists were bound with soft leather thongs, secured to the wood with a deliberate, almost ceremonial neatness. They were not gagged, but a profound, collective silence held them captive more effectively than any cloth. Their dark eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, defiant pride, followed his every move. They were young, ranging from what looked to be late adolescence to early 20s. They wore simple hide dresses, unadorned, and their black hair was braided, clean, and cared for. This was not the work of brutish captors. This was something else entirely. Something colder, more calculated. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. His first instinct was pure, primal fear, a trap, a provocation. He scanned the horizon, the rolling hills, the shadowed coulees. Nothing. The land was as empty and quiet as it had been a moment before. His gaze returned to the porch, to them. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 16, trembled visibly, her eyes fixed on the ground. The one beside her, her face a mask of stoic resolve, met his gaze without flinching. Another watched him with an unnerving, analytical stillness, as if cataloguing his every breath. And the eldest, positioned nearest the door, carried herself with the authority of a leader, her chin held high, her fear buried deep beneath layers of responsibility. For a long moment he was paralyzed. The silence of his life had been shattered, replaced by a new, terrifying silence filled with unspoken questions and imminent threat. His isolation, once a source of comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. There was no one to call for, no one to consult. There was only him and the 4 women bound to his home and the vast, watching wilderness. He took a slow breath, the cold morning air stinging his lungs. The routines that had sustained him, the walls of grief he had built around himself, were useless now. He had been presented with a choice he never asked for, a test he did not understand. He reached for the hunting knife on his belt, its worn handle a familiar weight in his palm. The women tensed, a collective intake of breath, and the eldest straightened her spine even further, ready to meet whatever violence was coming. Arthur ignored their fear, his focus narrowed. He walked not towards them, but to the first post, and with a single, decisive motion, he sliced through the leather binding. The leather fell away, and the first woman, the one with the analytical gaze, slowly, cautiously, pulled her hand back. She rubbed her wrist, her eyes never leaving his face. Arthur moved to the next post, then the next, and the next, repeating the action with the same grim economy of motion. He did not speak. The sound of the blade slicing through the thongs was unnervingly loud in the morning stillness. When the last bond was cut, he stepped back, holding the knife loosely at his side, showing them his empty hands before sheathing it. He retreated to the far side of the porch, putting the well between them, a deliberate act of creating space. He watched them. They did not flee. They remained by the posts, now unbound but still captive, by fear, by uncertainty, by orders he could not fathom. The eldest, Winona, slowly pushed herself to her feet. She moved to her sisters, her presence a shield. Istus, the quiet observer, stood beside her. Then Wachiwi, the one who had trembled, was helped to her feet by Zitkala, the youngest and most defiant. They stood together, a small, united front, their dark eyes, a silent chorus of questions. Foes. Arthur's mind raced. Who had done this, and why his porch? He was a nobody, a recluse. He had no quarrel with the local tribes. He kept to his own, respected their boundaries. This felt personal, targeted. He thought of the town, redemption, a place teeming with men who saw the tribes as little more than vermin or obstacles. But this act had none of the chaotic brutality of a raid. It was precise, deliberate, a message. He turned and worked the pump handle of the well, the rhythmic squeak a familiar sound in the tense air. He filled a tin dipper with cold, clear water and placed it on the edge of the well housing, a good 10 feet from them. Then he backed away again, retreating to the cabin doorway. He gestured toward the water, a simple, universal offering. The women watched him, unmoving. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun climbed higher, chasing the last of the morning chill from the air. Arthur's legs began to ache from standing so still. Finally, Winona, the leader, gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Zitkala, the defiant one, moved first. She approached the well with the cautious grace of a deer, snatched the dipper, and drank deeply, her throat working. She drank not like someone merely thirsty, but like someone asserting a right. Then she returned to the group. One by one they came forward to drink, each movement guarded, each glance at him filled with suspicion. But they drank. Hunger would be next. His own stomach rumbled. He turned and went inside the cabin, leaving the door ajar. The interior was sparse and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed. And on a small shelf, a single small whittled wooden bird, its paint faded. Clara's. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. He took a half loaf of yesterday's bread from the bin and a round of cheese. It was plain fare, but it was all he had to offer. He carried it out and set it on the same spot where he'd left the water. He didn't wait for a reaction this time. He turned his back on them, a profound gesture of trust he wasn't sure he felt, and walked toward the corral to see to his horse. The morning chores would not wait, and perhaps the familiar rhythm would anchor him, would make sense of this madness. He could feel their 4 pairs of eyes on his back every step of the way. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent pattern. The women did not leave. They stayed near the cabin, a small, watchful constellation. They spoke to one another in their own tongue, their voices low and musical, a language that was part of the land itself. To Arthur, they remained silent. He went about his work, acutely aware of their presence. The heavy cloak of his solitude had been replaced by a tense, shared space. He left food and water for them each morning, and each evening it was gone. They slept huddled together on the porch, refusing his silent offer of the barn's warmer shelter. He learned their faces, their mannerisms. Winona was the clear matriarch, her gaze missing nothing, her posture one of constant vigilance. She was the one who rationed the food he left, who decided when and where they would sit. Istas was the thinker, her eyes always distant, as if she were seeing patterns in the wind or reading a story in the clouds. Wachiwi, the gentle one, seemed to possess a deep well of sadness that mirrored his own, and she often flinched at sudden noises. And Zitkala, the youngest, was a firecracker. Her defiance was a shield for her fear, and she would sometimes glare at him with an intensity that was almost comical on her young face. He did not try to speak to them again. He knew no Lakota, and he assumed they knew no English. Words, he figured, would only complicate the fragile, unspoken truce they had established. His actions would have to speak for him. He was a man who provided, who kept his distance, who meant no harm. He hoped that was enough. But the silence of the cabin was different now. Before, it had been an empty, echoing thing, a constant reminder of all he had lost. Now, it was filled with a quiet, breathing presence. He would sit at his table in the evening, eating his solitary meal, and he could hear the soft murmur of their voices from the porch, the rustle of their movements. It was unsettling, but it was also not entirely unwelcome. It was the sound of life. It was a sound he had forgotten. The breakthrough, when it came, was small and unexpected. It was nearly a week after their arrival. Arthur was in the small vegetable garden Eleanor had started, his hands deep in the soil, weeding around the struggling squash plants. It was a task he both loved and hated, a direct communion with her memory. He was lost in thought when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Wachiwi standing there. She held out a handful of wild berries, dark and plump, on a large leaf. He stared at her, then at the berries. It was an offering, a reciprocation. He slowly wiped his earthy hands on his trousers and reached out, taking a single berry. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, hesitant smile, the first he had seen from any of them, and popped a berry into her own mouth to show they were safe. He ate his. It was sweet, with a tart finish that burst on his tongue. "Thank you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She did not seem to understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded, placed the leaf of berries on a nearby crate, and then, to his utter astonishment, she knelt in the dirt beside him and began to weed. Her movements were deft and sure. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. Soon, Zitkala came to watch, her curiosity overriding her suspicion. Then Istas joined, her quiet presence a calm anchor. Winona stood back, observing, her expression unreadable but no longer hostile. That afternoon, they worked together in the garden. For the first time, they were not just observers in his space, but participants. The shared simple labor of tending the earth became a bridge across the chasm of language and culture. That evening, he cooked a stew with the day's harvest, a rabbit he had snared, and the vegetables from the garden. He left the pot on the porch hearth with 4 bowls and spoons. Later, from his window, he saw them sitting together, eating from the bowls, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of his lantern. Something inside Arthur began to shift. The hard, frozen ground of his grief began to thaw just a little around the edges. He started seeing them not as a collective problem, but as 4 individuals. He saw the way Istas would tilt her head to listen to the birds, the way Zitkala would race Wachiwi to the creek, their laughter a startling, beautiful sound against the wind. He saw the immense weight of responsibility on Winona's young shoulders and admired the strength with which she carried it. One evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, a violent, terrifying display of nature's power. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Arthur stood at his open cabin door, watching the women huddle together on the porch, trying to find shelter against the far wall. They were soaked, shivering. He couldn't leave them out there. His own memory of fever and cold was too sharp, too painful. He stepped out onto the porch, the wind tearing at his shirt. "Inside," he said, his voice loud to be heard over the storm. He gestured emphatically toward the open door. Winona hesitated, her eyes filled with distrust. The cabin was his space, his den. To enter it was to put themselves entirely at his mercy. But then a flash of lightning illuminated Wachiwe's pale, trembling form, and her resolve wavered. Arthur didn't wait for her permission. He went to Wachiwe, gently took her arm, and guided her toward the door. She went without resistance, too cold to argue. The others followed, one by one, led by Winona, who entered last, her gaze sweeping the small space, assessing every shadow for threats. He closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury. The cabin was suddenly small, crowded, filled with the scent of wet earth and rain. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it blazed, casting a warm, dancing light over their faces. He handed them dry blankets from his chest, his movements slow and non-threatening. They wrapped themselves in the rough wool and huddled near the fire, their shivering slowly subsiding. Arthur retreated to his corner, giving them the space around the hearth. He sat at his table and picked up the small wooden bird from the shelf. He ran his thumb over its smooth, worn surface, the action automatic, unconscious. He didn't realize he was being watched until he looked up and saw Istas's intelligent eyes on him, then on the bird. He saw not pity in her gaze, but a quiet, profound understanding. In that moment, he felt a flicker of connection so deep it startled him. She saw his pain. She saw the ghost in the room. He cleared his throat and carefully placed the bird back on its shelf. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, nor the tense silence of suspicion. It was a shared, peaceful quiet. A fragile truce had become a fragile trust. For the first time in 7 years, Arthur Blackwood did not feel entirely alone. He was sharing his home, and in doing so, he was beginning to feel like he had one again. The tentative peace of their new existence was a delicate thing, a spider's web in a world of stomping boots. Arthur knew it couldn't last. The world outside his property lines was still there, and it was a world that did not look kindly on a white man sheltering 4 Lakota women. The first tremor came in the form of Garrett Vance. Vance was a man who thrived on the festering prejudices of redemption. He was a rancher with more land than sense, and a cruelty that he mistook for strength. He and 2 of his hired hands rode up to Arthur's fence one afternoon, their horses kicking up dust that settled on the new, fragile green in the garden. Arthur saw them coming from a mile off. He told the women to go inside the barn and stay hidden, his tone low and urgent. For the first time, Winona obeyed without question, herding her sisters into the shadows of the hayloft. Arthur met Vance at the fence, his posture relaxed, his hands empty and visible. He leaned against a post as if he had all the time in the world. "Blackwood," Vance said, his voice a gravelly sneer. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Arthur's boot. "Heard you got some company." "Just me and the wind, Vance," Arthur replied, his voice flat, "same as always." Vance's eyes, small and porcine, scanned the property. They lingered on the cabin, the barn, the garden where 4 sets of footprints were still visible in the soft earth. "That ain't the story making the rounds in town. Story is you're keeping a private collection of squaws out here, 4 of 'em." Arthur's blood ran cold, but his face remained a mask of indifference. People in redemption have too much time on their hands. They should worry more about their own souls. "Oh, I'm worried about souls, all right," Vance chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "A man like you, all alone out here, it ain't healthy. A man gets ideas. We just came to see if you needed any help. Maybe take them off your hands. The government pays a decent bounty for strays." The word strays landed like a punch to the gut. Arthur pushed himself off the fence post, his quiet demeanor hardening into something colder, sharper. "There's nothing here for you, Vance. This is my land. You do well to remember that." "Is that so?" Vance's smile vanished. He shared a look with his men. "We'll see about that. A man can't just hoard property, especially not that kind of property." He wheeled his horse around. "We'll be back, Blackwood. Count on it." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, choking sense of dread in their wake. Arthur watched them until they were small specks on the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The protective instinct that rose in him was fierce, primal. It was the same feeling he'd had when Clara had a fever, the desperate need to stand between his child and the darkness. He had failed then. He would not fail now. He went to the barn. The women emerged from the hayloft, their faces pale. They had heard everything. Winona's eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear, but a shared understanding of the coming fight. The unspoken truce was over. They were allies now, bound by a common enemy. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with anticipation. Arthur cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. The women sat by the fire, sharpening kitchen knives on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a grim counterpoint to the chirping of crickets outside. There was no need for words. They were preparing for a siege. Arthur felt a strange sense of clarity. For 7 years he had been drifting, a man without purpose. Now purpose had been thrust upon him. It was simple, elemental, to protect the life that had taken root in his desolate world. These women, who had arrived as a mystery, a burden, had become the heart of his home. Their quiet dignity, their resilience, their unexpected laughter had tilled the fallow soil of his soul. To let Vance and his ilk harm them would be to let the last light in his life be extinguished. He looked at them, a small fortress of women by his hearth. Winona, the unbreachable wall. Istus, the strategist, her eyes darting toward the windows. Wachiwi, no longer trembling, but holding her knife with a steady hand, and Zitkala, her youthful face set in a grim, determined line. They were not victims waiting for rescue. They were warriors. "They will come tonight," Arthur said, breaking the silence. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it in his bones. The moon was a slender sliver, offering little light. It was a night for predators. Winona looked at him and gave a single, sharp nod. She then spoke to her sisters in Lakota, her voice calm and commanding. They took their positions, 2 by the single window, 2 flanking the door. Arthur took his place by the other window, his rifle resting on the sill. And then they waited. The cabin grew silent once more, but this was the silence of a held breath, the taut, humming silence before a lightning strike. The hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the low fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. He thought of Eleanor, of her strength and her kindness. He thought of Clara, of the fierce, boundless love he had for her. The grief was still there, a permanent fixture in the architecture of his being, but it was no longer a hollow void. It was a source of strength. It was the memory of what was worth fighting for. They came just after midnight, the soft thud of horses' hooves on damp earth. Arthur saw their shapes moving in the darkness, dismounting near the fence line, 3 of them, Vance and his 2 men. They moved toward the cabin like wolves, confident in their numbers and their malice. "Blackwood," Vance's voice cut through the night, a harsh, ugly sound. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're with. Send out the squaws, and we'll let you live. This ain't your fight." Arthur's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. He looked at Winona. Her eyes were chips of obsidian in the firelight. She gave him another curt nod. This was their decision as much as his. He raised his voice, pitching it to carry. "You're on my land, Vance. I'm giving you one chance to turn around and ride away." A harsh laugh answered him. Brave words for a dead man. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the window frame next to Arthur's head. The siege had begun. He didn't return fire. Ammunition was precious, and he wouldn't waste it on shadows. The women remained perfectly still, their discipline absolute. Another shot, this one shattering a pane of glass. Cold night air rushed in. Then, the heavy thud of a body hitting the cabin door. They were trying to break it down. Arthur moved away from the window, pressing his back against the wall beside the door, his rifle ready. Winona and Zitkala flanked the other side, their knives held low. The door shuddered again, the wood groaning in protest. The bar he had set across it was thick oak, but it wouldn't hold forever. Another slam, harder this time. A crack appeared in the door. They were using a log as a ram. Arthur's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He prepared himself. The moment the door gave way, there would be chaos, violence, and death. He was ready to meet it. The door splintered, then burst inward with a deafening crash, the bar flying across the room. The shape of a man filled the doorway, silhouetted against the faint starlight. Before Arthur could even raise his rifle, something moved in the darkness with impossible speed. It was Winona. She launched herself forward, not with a scream, but with a low, guttural cry. Her knife flashed in the firelight. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and stumbled back. Another man, Vance, pushed past him, a pistol in his hand. Arthur swung his rifle, not to shoot, but using it as a club, catching Vance hard in the shoulder. The pistol discharged into the ceiling as Vance staggered sideways, roaring in pain and fury. The third man charged in, but was met by Istus and Wachiwi, who moved with a terrifying, coordinated grace, their own knives weaving a deadly pattern in the confined space. It was a desperate, chaotic melee in the small cabin. Grunts of pain, the clash of steel, the crash of overturned furniture. Arthur wrestled with Vance, a brutal, close-quarters struggle. Vance was bigger, heavier, but Arthur was fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He drove his fist into Vance's face, then again, feeling cartilage crunch under his knuckles. Just as Vance fell back, his eyes rolling in his head, a new sound cut through the din. It was a cry from outside, high and sharp, a sound that was both a command and a warning. It was followed by the thunder of a dozen horses, appearing as if from the very earth itself. The fighting inside the cabin stopped instantly. Everyone froze. From the darkness outside the broken doorway, figures emerged. Tall, imposing men, their faces painted for war, their hands holding rifles and war clubs. They moved with a silent, lethal purpose, surrounding the cabin. And then a man stepped into the doorway, his presence commanding the space. He was older, his face a testament to a life of hardship and leadership, his long hair streaked with gray. His eyes, dark and piercing, surveyed the scene. The broken door, the disheveled figures of Vance and his men, Arthur standing with his rifle, and the four women, unharmed, standing ready. He was the father. He had to be. Vance's remaining henchman, seeing the ring of warriors, dropped his knife with a clatter and raised his hands, his face a mask of pure terror. Vance, dazed on the floor, simply stared, his arrogance shattered. The chief, for he could be nothing else, let his gaze rest on his daughters. He spoke a single word in Lakota. Winona answered, her voice steady, recounting the night's events. The chief listened, his expression unreadable, then his eyes found Arthur. He looked at the white man, at his bruised knuckles and his steady rifle, at the protective stance he still held in front of the women. He looked at him for a long, silent moment, and in that gaze, Arthur felt he was being weighed, measured, and judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his heart. The chief gave a sharp command. Two of his warriors entered the cabin, seizing Vance and his men, hauling them to their feet. They dragged the terrified men outside, their pleas for mercy swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Their fate was sealed. The chief stepped fully into the cabin. He looked at Arthur, and then he spoke, his voice deep and resonant, and to Arthur's profound shock, he spoke in clear, deliberate English. "You did not run," the chief said. "It was not a question, it was a statement of fact." Arthur slowly lowered his rifle. "This is my home," he said simply. They were my guests." The chief's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He was Tashunka. He was the leader of a band of Lakota whose traditional lands bordered this territory. He explained, his words chosen with care, that his people were in a precarious position, caught between a sickness in their winter camp and the growing encroachment of men like Vance. He needed to move his people, but he could not risk his daughters on the journey. He had heard of the solitary white man, the one who lived in sorrow, who bothered no one and kept the old ways of respect. "I brought my daughters here," Tashunka said, his eyes meeting Arthur's. "I left them on your porch. It was a test, a desperate one. I needed to know if your heart was true before I could ask for your help. I have been watching, from the hills, every day. I saw you cut them free. I saw you share your food. I saw you stand against those men." He gestured to the broken door. "I saw you build a home where there was only a house." Arthur was speechless. The mystery was solved, but the truth of it was more staggering than anything he could have imagined. His every action for the past 2 weeks had been observed, evaluated. He had been part of a trial without even knowing it. Winona stepped forward, standing beside her father. She looked at Arthur, and for the first time her expression was completely open, stripped of its defensive layers. "My father Tashunka thanks you," she said, her own English as clear as her father's. "You have proven to be a man of honor, Arthur Blackwood." The name on her lips, spoken with respect, felt like a christening. He was no longer just the grieving widower. He was Arthur Blackwood, a man of honor. The aftermath was quiet. Tashunka's warriors disappeared as silently as they had arrived, taking Vance and his men with them. Justice would be meted out on their own terms. Tashunka stayed, sharing a pipe with Arthur by the fire in the now quiet cabin. They spoke for hours, two fathers from different worlds, finding common ground in their shared desire to protect what they loved. They spoke of loss, of hardship, of the changing land. A bridge of understanding was built over the ashes of the night's conflict. In the morning, the women prepared to leave. Their ordeal was over. They could rejoin their people, who were now making a safe passage to a new valley. The goodbyes were not spoken with words, but with looks and gestures. Wachiwi placed a small, intricately beaded pouch in his hand. Ista simply met his gaze with a look of deep, grateful understanding. Zitkala, her youthful defiance replaced by a newfound respect, gave him a quick, shy smile. Winona was the last. She stood before him on the porch, the morning sun casting a warm glow around her. "You have a strong heart, Arthur Blackwood," she said. "My father says it is a heart big enough to heal. You," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you brought life back to this place. I won't forget that." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, a gesture of profound connection. Then she turned and joined her father and sisters, mounting the horses they had brought. Arthur stood on his porch and watched them ride away, their forms growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the vastness of the plains. He turned and looked at his cabin. The door was broken, the inside a mess, but it felt more like a home than it had in 7 years. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the hollow ache of absence, but the quiet peace of earned solitude. It was filled with the echoes of laughter, the memory of shared work, the warmth of a fire shared with new friends. He walked inside and began to clean up, to repair what was broken. As he worked, he found the small, whittled bird on the floor where it had fallen. He picked it up and placed it back on its shelf. But this time, he set the beaded pouch Wachiwi had given him right beside it, the past and the present, together. He was no longer a man trapped in a memory. He had been tested, and in protecting others, he had inadvertently saved himself. The wind still blew across the empty plains, but to Arthur Blackwood, it no longer sounded like a thing grieving. It sounded like a promise. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but he had learned that even in the most desolate of landscapes, unexpected kindness could take root, and the truest home was the one you built in the hearts of others.